Cardiac cycle is a sequence of events that happen in the heart. Before we start with cardiac cycle, we should remember that systole means contraction and diastole means relaxation. We should be familiar with the two concepts, the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume. The end diastolic volume, which is the blood volume at the end of diastole. That means that the maximum filling of the ventricle is the end diastolic volume. The end systolic volume, which is the blood volume at the end of systole. What do you mean by that? We mean that the remaining 1/3 of blood in the ventricle, that is the end systolic volume. Let's start with cardiac cycle phases. Let's start with phase number 1, which is resting phase. Phase number 1, 70 to 80% of blood will flow passively from atria to ventricles. Why passively? Because both atria and ventricles are at diastole state or at relaxed state. At this phase, the semilunar valves are totally closed. Only the atrioventricular valve are opened. Let's go to phase number 2, which is atrial systole. At this phase, the remaining 20 to 30% of blood that are found in the atria will go to the ventricle. How? By contraction of the atria. That's why we call it atrial systole, contraction of atria. Also, the semilunar valves are still closed at this phase. Now, phase 3, we call it the isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Iso means the same. At this phase, the atrioventricular valve will be closed, and this closure will lead to the first hard sound, lub. We should know about lub that it is louder and longer than the second one. At this phase, the semilunar valve are still closed, and the atria is at diastole is relaxed, and that will lead to increase the pressure at the ventricle. Phase 4, ventricular ejection. At this phase, the semilunar valves are opened and the blood will be pumped to the aorta or the pulmonary plexus. Phase 5, which we call it isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. Iso, as we say, means the same volume. The atrioventricular valve are still closed, but the semilunar valve will be closed at this phase, and the closure at this phase of the semilunar valve will lead to make the second hard sound, which is dub. Lastly, there is phase 6, which we call it ventricular relaxation. At this phase, the atrioventricular valves are opened. Why they are opened? Because the blood pressure at the ventricle will drop further below the atria, and that will lead to opening of the atrioventricular valve, and the blood will flow from atria to ventricle, and the cycle will go over again and again.